April 25, 1945. East bank of the Elbe River, 3 kilometers west of Torgau, Germany. Lieutenant Grigory Golosov of the 58th Guards Rifle Division crouched behind the stone remnants of a destroyed mill at 13:40 hours, watching American soldiers through German binoculars he had taken from a dead Wehrmacht officer near Seelow Heights 3 weeks earlier. 400 meters of grey water separated him from men he had been told were allies for 4 years, but had never seen until this moment. The Americans were smoking. Golosov could see the small movements, the casual gestures of men lighting cigarettes and passing them to others. Their uniforms appeared clean. Not parade ground clean, but cleaner than anything Golosov had seen on a Soviet soldier since 1941. The vehicles behind them sat in neat rows. Jeeps, he had heard them called. Small, open vehicles that appeared identical to each other, painted the same olive colour, lined up as if they had rolled off the same assembly line on the same day, which Golosov supposed they probably had. He had been fighting for 3 years and 10 months. Stalingrad, where he had eaten leather from his boots boiled in melted snow. Kursk, where the earth had shaken for 17 days straight from artillery fire. The Vistula crossing, where he had dragged his wounded sergeant across ice while German machine guns tore the frozen river surface into crystals of blood and water. Berlin's approaches, where every street corner held a Panzerfaust and every basement hid Hitler Youth with stolen rifles. His division had started the war with 10,000 men. 2,400 remained. The boots Golosov wore had belonged to a German Hauptmann he had found face down in Polish mud near Poznan in February. His 4th pair of boots since the war began. Before these, he had worn felt Valenki that rotted in spring mud. Before those, improvised footwear wrapped with cloth and wire. Before those, the standard-issue boots he had received in 1941, which had fallen apart by winter of that same year. The German boots fit well. The Hauptmann's feet had been approximately the same size as his own. His uniform was a composite. The tunic was Soviet, issued in 1943, patched twice at the elbows. The trousers were also German, taken from the same Hauptmann, better wool than anything Soviet quartermasters provided. His belt was Soviet. His canteen was American, from a Lend-Lease shipment, stamped with English words he could not read. His rifle, the Mosin Nagant M1891-30, leaning against the mill wall beside him, had been manufactured in Tula in 1936. 9 years old, 3 different wars, if you counted Finland. Through the binoculars, Golosov studied the American weapons. The rifles were dark wood and steel, shorter than his Mosin Nagant, and every soldier appeared to carry an identical model. He had heard about the Garand. Semi-automatic, 8 rounds, self-loading. His own rifle required him to work the bolt between each shot, had worked the same bolt thousands of times, had worn the metal smooth with his palm. 5 rounds, manual operation, the same design Russian soldiers had carried against the Japanese in 1905. A convoy of American trucks moved behind the smoking soldiers. Golosov counted 12 vehicles in 30 seconds before losing count. All the same model, all the same colour, all moving at the same steady pace. The 58th Guards Division had perhaps 200 vehicles total, and these included captured German trucks, American Lend-Lease Studebakers, Soviet ZIS-5s from 3 different production years, and horse-drawn carts that had hauled supplies since his grandfather's war against the Ottomans. The American position across the river appeared almost casual. Men standing in groups, sitting on vehicle hoods, walking without the constant awareness of snipers that had defined Golosov's existence since Stalingrad. Perhaps they had cleared the area thoroughly. Perhaps they had so much ammunition they could afford to suppress every potential firing position. Perhaps they simply did not care. Golosov had learned to move between covered positions, to never skyline himself, to assume every shadow held a German with a rifle. These Americans stood in the open as if they owned the air itself. At 1400 hours, Major Belov appeared beside him, moving quietly for a man carrying 20 extra kilograms. Belov had been a political officer before transferring to line command after his predecessor died at Kursk. He still carried the ideological certainty in his voice, but 3 years of combat had tempered the stupidity. "The colonel wants a patrol across," Belov said. 5 men. Establish contact, assess their disposition, determine coordination protocols. You volunteer. Golosov had not volunteered, but he understood the statement's actual meaning. He would go because he spoke some German, which was closer to English than Russian was, and because he had survived this long, which suggested competence, and because refusing a major's volunteer suggestion meant political complications Golosov preferred to avoid. "When?" Golosov asked. 14:30. Senior Lieutenant Silvashko will accompany you. 3 enlisted men. Your selection. Golosov nodded. Through the binoculars, he watched an American soldier discard a cigarette after smoking only half. The cigarette fell to the ground, still burning. Another soldier immediately lit a fresh one. Golosov's own tobacco ration consisted of makorka, coarse leaf often mixed with newspaper, distributed in small portions that he stretched across days. He had not thrown away a partially smoked cigarette since 1941. "What do we know about them?" Golosov asked. 69th Infantry Division, American First Army. They have been fighting in Europe for 11 months. 11 months. Golosov had been fighting for 46 months. He wondered what 11 months of war looked like to men who still had clean uniforms and cigarettes to waste. He would find out in 30 minutes. Across 400 meters of German river water, the Americans waited, smoking their cigarettes and standing in the open sunlight, while Golosov prepared to meet the Allies he had been promised would help destroy fascism. He wondered if they would offer him a cigarette. He wondered if it would taste different from the newspaper-wrapped makorka that had sustained him through 3 years of killing. He would know soon enough. At 14:26 hours, Golosov sat in a wooden boat that smelled of fish and old river water, rowing across the Elbe with 4 other Soviet soldiers. Senior Lieutenant Silvashko sat at the bow, rigid and formal, his uniform the cleanest available in the entire battalion. The 3 enlisted men, Privates Kuskov, Denisov, and Markov, pulled oars with the mechanical efficiency of men who had rowed across the Dnieper, the Vistula, and a dozen smaller rivers whose names Golosov no longer remembered. The current pulled them south. They compensated, angling north, making the crossing diagonal. 240 meters of open water, with American rifles watching every meter. The Americans waited on the western bank. 5 men, standing in a loose group, weapons slung casually over shoulders. As the boat approached, Golosov could see their uniforms more clearly. Wool, properly dyed, matching in color and cut. The pants had creases. Golosov tried to remember the last time he had seen creased pants on a combat soldier, and failed. One American wore glasses, steel-rimmed, military issue apparently, because everything they carried appeared to be military issue, standardized, identical. The boat scraped against mud and stone. Golosov stepped into ankle-deep water, his German boots finding purchase on the rocky bottom. The Americans moved forward, hands extended for handshakes, smiling. The one with glasses spoke first. "Lieutenant William Robertson, 69th Infantry Division." His hand was extended. Golosov took it. "Lieutenant Grigory Golosov, 58th Guards Rifle Division." His English was terrible, filtered through his limited German. Robertson's handshake was firm, but not aggressive. His hand was clean. When Golosov released it, he glanced at his own palm, darkened with dirt that no amount of river water ever fully removed. Robertson was already offering something. A small package, white paper, small enough to fit in a palm. Cigarettes. Golosov accepted the package and examined it. Lucky Strike, printed in English letters he could read but not understand. The package was intact, machine-sealed, fresh. He opened it carefully and removed one cigarette. It was white paper, factory-rolled, perfect cylinder. He had not seen a cigarette this clean since before the war. Robertson produced a lighter, American chrome metal and lit Golosov's cigarette with a small, yellow flame. The tobacco was smooth, not harsh like macorca, not mixed with anything, just tobacco, properly cured, rolled in clean paper. Golosov inhaled and felt the smoke fill his lungs without the burning sensation he associated with smoking. He had forgotten tobacco could taste like this. Robertson lit his own cigarette, then offered the package to Silvashko and the three privates. They each took one, handling the cigarettes like artifacts from another civilization. Robertson gestured toward the weapons. Golosov understood without translation. "Show me yours, I'll show you mine." The universal language of soldiers comparing equipment. Golosov unslung his Mosin Nagant and held it horizontally for inspection. Robertson examined it with professional interest, not touching, just looking. Then Robertson unslung his own rifle. The Garand was heavier than Golosov expected, balanced differently, the weight forward. Robertson worked the action, showing the 8-round clip, the self-loading mechanism. He handed it to Golosov. The metal was clean, oiled, the wood stock smooth and finished. Golosov worked the bolt, felt the spring tension, examined the sights. This rifle had been manufactured recently, perhaps within the last year. His Mosin Nagant was 9 years old. Robertson's rifle represented a different approach to warfare. Volume of fire, rapid engagement, mechanical advantage. Golosov's rifle represented what Russian soldiers had always represented: endurance, simplicity, personal skill overcoming material limitations. One American, a private with red hair and freckles, gestured to his feet and then to Golosov's boots. Another comparison. The American wore leather boots, dark brown, properly fitted, laced with clean cord. The leather was treated, waterproof, the soles thick rubber. Golosov lifted his foot to show his German boot. The American nodded, understanding immediately. Captured equipment, standard practice. The American pointed to his own boots and said something that included the word issue. Golosov understood. These boots were provided, standard, everyone received the same. At 15:30 hours, Robertson made eating gestures. Universal language again. The Americans had brought food. Robertson opened a small cardboard box labeled with English text. "K ration," Golosov would learn later, though at this moment it was simply a box containing more food than he expected. Robertson removed items one by one and placed them on a flat rock. Crackers in wax paper. Canned meat. Small tin with a key opener attached. Processed cheese in a tin. A chocolate bar, brown wrapper with Hershey printed on it. Instant coffee in a packet. Sugar tablets, white, 6 in a small envelope. Cigarettes, 4, in a miniature package. Chewing gum, 2 sticks. This was one meal, one American soldier's single meal. The contents sat on the rock like an accusation. Golosov's daily ration consisted of black bread, often stale, weighing 600 grams when available. Kasha, buckwheat groats, perhaps 200 grams. Occasionally, canned stew from American Lend-Lease shipments, which he now realized the Americans considered emergency rations. Tea when available, without sugar. Macorca tobacco, 30 grams weekly. Robertson opened the chocolate bar and broke it into sections, offering pieces to each Soviet soldier. Golosov took a piece and placed it on his tongue. The taste was overwhelming. Sweetness, richness, complexity. He had not experienced since 1941. Chocolate. Real chocolate. He had not tasted chocolate in 4 years. His monthly salary as lieutenant, 1,000 rubles, would not purchase this chocolate bar on the black market in Moscow if chocolate were available at all, which it was not. The American private, the one with red hair, was opening the canned meat with the attached key. He dumped half the contents onto a cracker, ate it in 2 bites, then discarded the remaining half tin. He simply threw it aside, the meat still inside, visible, wasted. Kuskov watched this with an expression Golosov recognized. Disbelief. Anger, perhaps. That half tin of meat would feed a Soviet soldier for half a day. The American had thrown it away because he was full, because he had more in his truck, because waste was so routine it required no thought. Robertson was brewing coffee now, using a small portable stove, a metal contraption that burned some kind of fuel tablet. Real coffee, not ersatz, with condensed milk from a small tin and sugar, real sugar, white crystals he poured freely from a paper packet. The coffee smelled like memory, like Moscow before the war, like cafes Golosov had not thought about in years because thinking about such things made the present unbearable. Robertson handed him a metal cup. The coffee was hot, sweet, perfect. Golosov drank it slowly, making it last, knowing this might be the only real coffee he tasted for the rest of his life. Robertson was saying something, gesturing back toward the American vehicles. Invitation. Come see. Golosov nodded. As they walked toward the jeeps, he noticed that the 5 Americans had left their K-ration debris behind, half-empty tins, wrappers, cigarette butts. They would not return for it. It was garbage to them. To Golosov, it represented more portable food than his entire squad carried in their packs. The Americans were already walking away, leading him toward vehicles that all matched, toward equipment that all functioned, toward an army that could afford to throw away food while fighting a war that had already cost Golosov everything he had been before it started. April 26, 1945. Golosov stood inside an American field hospital 3 miles behind their forward positions, watching a surgeon operate on a German prisoner under electric lights powered by a generator that hummed outside the tent. The hospital had 200 beds arranged in rows, white sheets on each bed, actual sheets, not blankets or coats. A nurse walked between beds, carrying a tray of instruments that gleamed under the electric light. Another nurse hung a clear bag of plasma on a metal stand beside a wounded American soldier. The plasma dripped through a rubber tube into the soldier's arm. Golosov had seen plasma before, in Lend-Lease shipments, but never used so freely. Soviet medics rationed plasma strictly, saving it for officers and critical cases. This American private was receiving it for a leg wound that would heal. The American medical officer, a captain named Winters, showed Golosov the supply room. Metal shelves held bandages stacked to the ceiling. Morphine syringes filled an entire box, hundreds of small tubes, each containing enough morphine for 1 injection. Winters explained that every American medic carried 6 syringes as standard equipment. Soviet medics received morphine in limited quantities and logged every use. Winters opened a refrigerated cabinet powered by the same generator and removed a bottle of penicillin. The bottle was one of dozens stored at controlled temperature. Penicillin, the medicine that prevented infection, the medicine that saved lives from wounds that would otherwise kill through gangrene and sepsis. Soviet hospitals had penicillin, some shipped through Lend-Lease, but quantities were limited and distribution was controlled at the highest levels. Winters had a refrigerator full of it 3 miles from the front line. In the communications tent, Golosov watched an American sergeant speak into a radio the size of a small suitcase. The sergeant was talking to a unit 5 miles away, coordinating artillery support, and the conversation was clear, no static, no repetition needed. The radio operated on frequency modulation, Winters explained, which Golosov did not understand but recognized as superior to the amplitude modulation radios Soviet units used. The American battalion had 15 of these radios. Golosov's entire division had perhaps 20 radios total, and most of those required vehicle transport. The Americans had smaller radios too, portable units called walkie-talkies that squad leaders carried. Robertson showed him one, demonstrated it by walking 50 meters away and speaking clearly through the device. Golosov held the walkie-talkie and heard Robertson's voice as if he were standing beside him. Soviet communications relied on radio for division level, motorcycle couriers for regiment level, and runners on foot for company level. These Americans had radio communication down to the squad. The vehicle park stretched for 200 meters. Golosov counted jeeps until he reached 30 and stopped counting. Trucks, the Americans called them 2.5-ton trucks, stood in rows of 20 or more. Everything matched. Same paint, same design, same configuration. A mechanic was changing a tyre on one Jeep, and the spare tyre was identical to the original. Interchangeable parts, Robertson explained. Any part, from any Jeep, fits any other Jeep. Soviet vehicles came from different factories in different years with different specifications. Mechanics improvised, adapted, fabricated custom solutions for each repair. These Americans simply replaced broken parts with identical new parts from supply. The fuel dumps sat behind earth berms for protection. 55-gallon drums stacked 4 high, rows extending 30 meters. Golosov estimated several hundred drums visible, representing thousands of gallons of gasoline. Robertson mentioned this was a 3-day supply for the division. 3 days. The 58th Guards Division measured fuel in litres per vehicle, rationed carefully, supplemented with captured German fuel. These Americans measured fuel in thousands of gallons and worried about 3-day supplies the way Soviet quartermasters worried about 3-hour supplies. At 1600 hours, a supply convoy arrived. 12 trucks, each carrying cargo covered with canvas tarps. Golosov watched American soldiers unload crates of rations, boxes of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and containers he could not identify. The trucks had driven from a rail depot 80 miles west, Robertson explained, and this convoy arrived daily. Daily. The Soviet supply system moved material from Odessa or Murmansk by rail to marshalling yards, then by whatever vehicles were available to forward dumps, then by horse cart or human carry to the front. The system was improvised, interrupted, constantly inadequate. The American system was scheduled, coordinated, reliable. Robertson showed him a typed schedule listing convoy arrivals for the next week. The Americans knew what supplies would arrive on May 2nd because the system functioned with calendar precision. The mess tent served dinner at 17:30 hours. Golosov sat on a bench beside Silvashko and watched American soldiers move through a line, receiving food from cooks who served from steaming metal containers. The smell was overwhelming. Meat, actual meat, roasted. Vegetables, multiple kinds. Bread, white bread, soft. Butter in small rectangular portions. Coffee brewing in a large pot. Canned fruit, yellow peaches in syrup. Each soldier received a metal tray divided into sections, and cooks filled each section. Golosov received the same tray, the same portions. The meat was beef, seasoned, cooked until tender. The vegetables were carrots and green beans, hot with butter. The bread was fresh, baked today in mobile ovens the Americans transported. Butter, real butter, came in small portions wrapped in paper printed with US Army. The coffee was strong and hot, with sugar and condensed milk available in unlimited quantities. Soviet field kitchens served kashar from cast-iron pots, transported on carts. Black bread, often stale by the time it reached forward units. Occasionally stew, usually containing more water than meat. Tea when available, without sugar. The meal Golosov was eating represented more calories than he typically consumed in a full day. The Americans ate this meal every day, supplemented with K rations in the field. Their quartermasters calculated rations at 4,000 calories daily for combat soldiers. Soviet rations provided perhaps 3,000 calories when supply functioned properly, which it often did not. After dinner, Robertson took Golosov to the post exchange, a tent where American soldiers could purchase items using military scrip. The tent contained shelves stocked with goods Golosov associated with pre-war civilian life. Candy bars, various brands, arranged in boxes, Hershey, Butterfinger, Baby Ruth, cigarettes in cartons, Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, Coca-Cola in bottles, stored in a box cooled with ice, beer, weak by Soviet standards but available in cases, writing paper, envelopes, pens, soap, toothpaste, razor blades, playing cards, magazines, paperback books. A price list hung on the tent wall. Candy bars cost 5 cents. Coca-Cola cost 5 cents. Cigarettes cost 10 cents per pack, $1 per carton. Beer cost 20 cents per bottle. Robertson explained that American privates earned $50 monthly. A private could purchase 100 candy bars with 1 month's pay, or 200 Coca-Colas, or 5 cartons of cigarettes. Soviet privates earned 8 rubles monthly. Officers earned more, but still inadequate amounts. There was nothing to purchase, regardless of pay. No stores, no goods, no luxury items. The war economy produced weapons and ammunition and essential supplies. Consumer goods did not exist. This American post exchange, operating 3 miles from the front line in the middle of a war, sold candy and soda to enlisted men for pocket change. Golosov stood in the tent holding a Coca-Cola bottle Robertson had purchased for him, 5 cents, and felt the cold glass against his palm. The bottle had been manufactured in a factory somewhere in America, filled with carbonated syrup, transported across an ocean, shipped by rail across France and Germany, and delivered to this tent so an American private could buy it for the price Soviet citizens would not earn in a week of labour, if such bottles existed in the Soviet Union at all, which they did not. April 27th, 1945, evening. The joint celebration began at 1800 hours in a clearing between the American and Soviet positions, where soldiers from both armies gathered around tables constructed from wooden planks laid across ammunition crates. The Americans had brought most of the food. Golosov watched as they unloaded crates from trucks, setting out canned ham still in the tins, corned beef in rectangular containers, white bread in loaves that had been baked that morning, butter in pound blocks, cheese wrapped in wax paper, canned vegetables, and fruit cocktail in metal tins. They produced cases of beer, the weak American beer at 3.2% alcohol that Soviet soldiers considered barely alcoholic. But cases of it, dozens of bottles, more beer than Golosov had seen since before the war. The Soviet contribution sat on one end of the table. 5 bottles of vodka, clear liquid in unmarked bottles, samagon that soldiers had distilled from whatever materials they could acquire. Black bread, dense and dark. Several loaves contributed from company supplies. Pickles in a jar that Markov had been saving for 2 months. The disparity was obvious to everyone present. The Americans had brought routine supplies, items from their regular logistics chain, rations they received continuously. The Soviets had brought luxury items, special reserves, things that required sacrifice to obtain. The Americans were feeding both armies from their normal supply. The Soviets were contributing what little extra they possessed. Senior Lieutenant Silvashko opened the first vodka bottle and poured shots into whatever cups were available. American canteen cups, Soviet tin cups, even empty food cans. The vodka was harsh, burning, powerful. Golosov drank his in one swallow, as tradition required, and felt the familiar fire spread through his chest. This vodka was not refined, not filtered through charcoal like premium brands. This was field vodka, soldier vodka, made to create oblivion quickly, because oblivion was sometimes the only escape from memory. Robertson tried his shot, coughed, and his eyes watered. The other Americans drank more carefully, sipping, which no Soviet soldier would do. You drank vodka fast, or not at all. The Americans opened beer bottles and drank steadily, casually, the way men drank beverages, rather than medicine. Their beer was cold, kept in ice that they transported in insulated boxes. Cold beer in April in Germany. Golosov had not drunk cold beer since summer of 1941 in Moscow, before everything changed. The Americans also produced bottles of whiskey from personal supplies, officers' bottles, and these they shared more selectively. Captain Winters gave Golosov a small glass of bourbon, American whiskey, aged, smooth, complex. Golosov had drunk German schnapps, Russian vodka, Polish spirits distilled from potatoes, but never American bourbon. It tasted like wood and smoke, and something sweet he could not identify. Winters explained it was aged in charred oak barrels for years. Years. Golosov could not imagine any country having surplus grain to distill into whiskey, and then waiting years for it to age while fighting a war. By 1900 hours, soldiers were trading items. The exchange started informally when Private Huff offered a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes to Kuskov, who had no equivalent item to trade in return. Huff simply gave the pack, then gave another to Denisov. The generosity was casual, unremarkable to Americans, stunning to Soviets. Within minutes, both armies were trading. Americans offered cigarettes, chocolate bars, chewing gum, canned food, instant coffee, soap, all items from their routine supplies. Soviet soldiers offered medals, ribbons, captured German insignia, military decorations, personal items. A staff sergeant named Miller traded 5 Hershey bars and a carton of Camels for a Soviet Guards badge, a small metal insignia worth perhaps 3 rubles official value. Miller remained pleased with the trade. The Soviet lieutenant who made the exchange, a man named Petrov from another company, took the chocolate and cigarettes with hands that trembled slightly. Golosov watched as transactions multiplied around him. A Soviet private traded his combat medal, awarded for bravery at Kursk, for 10 chocolate bars and 2 cartons of American cigarettes. Another Soviet soldier traded a captured German Luger pistol for 6 cans of corned beef, a pound of coffee, and a box of sugar cubes. The Americans were collecting souvenirs, items to send home, proof they had met the Russians. The Soviets were collecting survival resources, food that could be sent to starving families, tobacco that could be traded on black markets, soap that had not been available in Soviet stores for 3 years. What Americans considered memorabilia, Soviets considered currency. The value disparity was enormous. 1 carton of American cigarettes equaled 1 month of a Soviet officer's salary on the black market in Moscow. A pound of coffee equaled 2 months. The chocolate had no black market equivalent because chocolate did not exist in the Soviet Union as a civilian commodity. An American corporal produced a portable phonograph from his Jeep, a machine that played recorded music from flat black discs. He wound a handle on the side and placed a needle on the spinning disc. Music emerged from a small horn speaker, big band music, jazz, Glenn Miller's orchestra playing arrangements Golosov recognized from before the war when such music had been available on Radio Moscow, before authorities denounced it as decadent Western corruption. The Americans began dancing, awkward soldier dancing, pulling each other around in rough approximations of swing steps. Some Soviet soldiers watched with fascination. Jazz had been forbidden, declared degenerate, classified as enemy culture. Yet here it was, playing from a portable machine that ran on a spring mechanism, no electricity required, representing American consumer technology that did not exist in Soviet civilian production. Soviet soldiers contributed folk songs, traditional melodies that required no instruments, just voices. They sang about the Volga, about going home, about girls waiting in distant villages. The singing was good, trained, harmonized. Russian soldiers had always sung. It cost nothing, required no equipment, provided comfort that no amount of vodka could fully achieve. The Americans listened respectfully, applauded, though they understood no words. The contrast was complete. American entertainment was mechanized, reproducible, portable, powered by industrial manufacturing. Soviet entertainment was human-powered, spontaneous, traditional, requiring only voices that still functioned after 4 years of screaming orders and breathing smoke. At 2100 hours, an American soldier produced a camera, a Kodak Brownie, small black box with a lens on front. He began taking photographs, positioning soldiers in groups, Americans and Soviets together, arms around shoulders, smiling for the camera. Golosov had not been photographed since 1941. The camera clicked, advanced film with a small lever. Clicked again. The American explained he could take 12 photographs before needing to reload. 12 photographs on one roll of film. He was taking them casually, using up film the way Americans used up everything. Abundant, disposable, replaceable. Robertson arranged a photograph of himself with Golosov, both men standing stiffly, formal. The camera clicked. Robertson promised to send Golosov a copy when the film was developed. The Americans had portable photo laboratories, could develop film in the field, another technology Golosov associated with civilian peacetime life, not military operations. As the celebration continued into darkness, soldiers on both sides became drunk. Barriers dissolved, and men spoke in fragments of German and Russian and English, communicating through gestures and tone rather than words. An American private gave Golosov his home address in Iowa, made him promise to write after the war ended. Golosov accepted the paper, with the address written in careful English letters, and placed it in his pocket, knowing he would never write, knowing Soviet citizens did not correspond with Americans, knowing this moment of brotherhood would not survive whatever came after the war ended. The Americans would return to a country where chocolate cost 5 cents and cameras were consumer items. Golosov would return to a country where his family had not eaten chocolate in 4 years, and cameras existed only in official capacity. The gap was not bridgeable through friendship or shared victory. It was systemic, structural, absolute. But for this one evening in April of 1945, it did not matter. And Golosov drank American beer and ate American chocolate and listened to American jazz and pretended that the world was simpler than he knew it to be. April 28th, 1945. 0800 hours. Major Belov summoned all officers who had participated in liaison duties with the Americans to division headquarters, a commandeered German farmhouse 2 kilometers east of the Elbe. Golosov sat on a wooden bench beside Silvashko and 3 other lieutenants, waiting while the political officer, Zampolit Krasnov, arranged papers on a table. Krasnov was 40 years old, had never been in combat before Stalingrad, and had survived by understanding what could be said and what could not be said. He looked at the assembled officers with an expression Golosov recognized. Concern, perhaps fear. The Americans had created a problem that required careful management. Krasnov spoke for 20 minutes about international solidarity, the united front against fascism, the brotherhood of Soviet and American workers fighting capitalist imperialist aggression. The words were familiar, standard, required. Then Krasnov's tone changed. He explained that reports regarding American forces must be accurate, but also ideologically correct. Officers must describe what they observed, but must frame observations within proper socialist understanding. American abundance was temporary, the result of geographic isolation from combat, of exploiting colonial resources, of capitalist hoarding while workers suffered. Soviet shortages represented noble sacrifice for the defense of the motherland, proof of dedication exceeding mere material comfort. Any report suggesting American superiority or Soviet inadequacy would be misinterpreted by those who did not understand dialectical materialism. Golosov understood perfectly. Write the truth, but only the truth that fit approved narratives. Mention American equipment, but do not compare it favorably to Soviet equipment. Acknowledge American supplies, but do not quantify them in ways that suggested embarrassing disparity. Describe coordination and cooperation, but do not describe chocolate bars or cold beer or portable phonographs. The report must be factual, yet politically safe, detailed, yet appropriately vague, honest, yet carefully dishonest. He wrote his report that afternoon, sitting at a field desk in the tent he shared with 3 other officers. The report required 800 words. He described the meeting at the Elbe, the establishment of liaison protocols, the coordination of prisoner handling procedures, the agreement to prevent friendly fire incidents through radio communication and marked boundaries. He mentioned that American forces demonstrated adequate combat capability and possessed functional equipment appropriate for their operational requirements. He noted that American rations were sufficient and that medical facilities met Geneva Convention standards. He described successful cooperation and mutual respect between Allied forces fighting the common fascist enemy. What Golosov did not write required more careful consideration than what he did write. He did not write that American privates wore better boots than Soviet officers. He did not write that Americans threw away half-eaten cans of meat while Soviet soldiers rationed black bread by the gram. He did not write that American field hospitals had refrigerated penicillin while Soviet hospitals rationed morphine by the injection. He did not write that American divisions had 2,000 vehicles while Soviet divisions had 200. He did not write that Americans gave away chocolate bars that cost more than a Soviet soldier earned in a month. He did not write that he had seen the future, and it spoke English, and drank Coca-Cola, and listened to jazz on portable phonographs powered by spring, mechanisms that Soviet industry could not manufacture. His report concluded that American allies demonstrated satisfactory commitment to anti-fascist struggle and that coordination between Soviet and American forces proceeded according to protocols established by higher command. The report was approved without revision. Krasnov read it, nodded, filed it with other reports that would travel up the chain of command, becoming more abstract and less detailed at each level until they reached Moscow, as statistical summaries containing no information that would trouble anyone's understanding of how the world was supposed to function. Other officers were less careful. Lieutenant Kotzebue from 2nd Battalion wrote in a letter to his wife that Americans had everything and Soviets had nothing. The letter was intercepted by military censors. Kotzebue was questioned by Krasnov for 3 hours about his ideological reliability and his understanding of security protocols. The letter was destroyed. Kotzebue's wife never received it. Kotzebue wrote no more letters describing Americans. An unnamed officer from 3rd Battalion kept a diary that described in detail the American Post Exchange, the candy bars and cigarettes and Coca-Cola available for purchase, the casual abundance, the impossible wealth. The diary was discovered during a random inspection. The officer was transferred to a punishment battalion. The diary was confiscated. What happened to it after confiscation, no one knew. Golosov wrote one letter home that passed through censors because he wrote it carefully. He told his wife that he was healthy, and that the war would end soon, and that he had met American allies who were friendly and professional. He mentioned that he had eaten chocolate, without specifying where the chocolate came from, or how it compared to anything available in the Soviet Union. His wife would understand. She had not eaten chocolate since 1941. The fact that he had eaten it at all was message enough. He did not need to explain that an American private had given it to him casually. one of dozens of chocolate bars the private carried, distributed freely because chocolate was so common that sharing it required no thought. What Golosov understood but could not write, what every Soviet officer who had met Americans understood but could not say, was that 4 years of propaganda about American weakness and capitalist decay had been systematically false. The dying capitalism they had been told about for years was not dying. It was thriving. It was producing so much abundance that its soldiers gave away food to enemies and allies alike without reducing their own consumption. It was manufacturing equipment so standardized that any part fit any vehicle. It was delivering supplies so reliably that officers could schedule convoy arrivals a week in advance. The American system functioned at a level of organization and prosperity that Soviet officers had been taught was impossible under capitalism, that could only be achieved under socialism, that represented the future toward which history inevitably moved. Except the Americans had achieved it first, and they had done it while fighting a war on two fronts, and they had done it without the suffering and sacrifice that Soviet citizens had endured for 20 years in the name of building socialism. This knowledge was dangerous. Officers who understood it carried it carefully, discussed it never, buried it beneath layers of required belief and necessary faith. Golosov was a patriot. He had fought for 3 years and 10 months. He had watched friends die, had killed Germans personally, had survived battles that destroyed entire divisions. He believed in the Soviet Union, in the revolution, in the idea that socialism represented humanity's future. But he had also drunk American coffee with real sugar and real milk, had eaten American chocolate, had seen American abundance with his own eyes. These two beliefs could not coexist comfortably, so he chose the strategy that allowed him to continue functioning. He believed both things simultaneously, held them in separate compartments of his mind, acknowledged each when necessary, and never, ever compared them directly in any context where such comparison could be observed by others. This was how Soviet officers survived. This was how they maintained loyalty while knowing uncomfortable truths. This was how they continued serving a system they loved, despite evidence that the system might be failing in ways that ideology could not explain. And this was how Golosov wrote his report about meeting Americans at the Elbe River, saying everything required while saying nothing dangerous, preserving his career while burying his observations in language so careful that it communicated nothing except his understanding of what could not be communicated. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war against Germany ended officially at 2300 hours, though fighting had stopped days earlier when the Wehrmacht surrendered unconditionally. At Torgau, American and Soviet soldiers celebrated together for the second time in 2 weeks, and this time the celebration carried the weight of finality. The war was over. Men would go home. Some would live normal lives again, though Golosov doubted normalcy was possible after what they had experienced. The Americans brought more food, distributed it freely, gave away cigarettes and chocolate and chewing gum, as if victory had made abundance even more abundant. Golosov accepted a Hershey bar from Private Huff and placed it in his pocket to save for later, though later never came, because 3 days after the celebration, Stalin issued orders restricting Soviet-American fraternization. The orders came through official channels on May 11th. All Soviet personnel were to minimize contact with Western allies. Officers who had served as liaisons were to submit to additional political review. Soldiers who had accepted gifts from Americans were to report these gifts to political officers for evaluation. The official explanation involved security concerns, proper military discipline, and preventing the spread of false information about Allied contributions. The actual reason was obvious to anyone who had spent time with Americans. Soviet leadership had recognized what Golosov and every other liaison officer had recognized. Prolonged exposure to American abundance created ideological problems that no amount of political education could resolve. Better to separate the armies now, before more Soviet soldiers saw what American privates considered normal. By June of 1945, Soviet and American occupation zones were established in Germany, and Berlin was divided into 4 sectors. Soviet troops occupied the eastern sector. American troops occupied the western. The sectors were adjacent, separated by streets rather than rivers, and Soviet soldiers could see American positions clearly. They could see American supply trucks arriving daily. They could see American post exchanges serving chocolate and Coca-Cola. They could see American soldiers living in commandeered buildings with electricity and running water and heat. The contrast was continuous, unavoidable, visible every day. Soviet commanders responded by restricting troop movements, limiting interaction, increasing political education sessions that explained why American material advantages were temporary and meaningless compared to Soviet spiritual and ideological superiority. Golosov returned to the Soviet Union in late June, processed through demobilization centers that moved thousands of soldiers daily back toward homes they had not seen for 4 years. He was debriefed 3 times about his contact with Americans, asked the same questions in different configurations, watched carefully for signs of ideological contamination. He answered carefully, repeated approved phrases, demonstrated proper understanding. He was cleared for return to civilian life and assigned to Moscow, where he resumed work as an engineer in a factory that produced agricultural equipment. His apartment was 14 square meters, 1 room shared with his wife and daughter. They had running water on alternating days and electricity for 6 hours each evening. Food was rationed. Bread required coupons. Meat was rarely available. Sugar and butter existed primarily in memory. He never spoke to his wife or daughter about what he had seen at the Elbe. His daughter was 8 years old, born just before the war, and had never tasted chocolate. Golosov had saved the Hershey bar Private Huff gave him on Victory Day, carried it through demobilization, brought it home to Moscow. He gave it to his daughter on her 9th birthday in September of 1945. She held it carefully, unwrapped it slowly, broke off 1 small piece and placed it on her tongue. Her eyes closed. She smiled. She had never tasted anything like it. She ate the chocolate in small pieces over 3 days, rationing it, making it last. Golosov watched her eat it and remembered the American soldier who had given it to him casually, one of dozens he carried, distributed without thought because chocolate was so common that generosity cost nothing. The generation of Soviet officers who had met Americans at the Elbe carried their observations quietly through the following decades. They rose through ranks, assumed positions of authority, shaped Soviet military planning. They understood something that Soviet civilians did not understand. American power was real, material, systematic. American industrial capacity was not propaganda, not exaggeration, not temporary wartime mobilization. It was permanent capacity, the result of economic systems and social organization that produced abundance continuously. These officers knew this because they had seen it, but they could not say it publicly without destroying their careers and possibly their freedom. So they said it privately, in careful conversations with trusted colleagues, in subtle policy recommendations, in strategic assessments that emphasize caution when dealing with American power. Marshal Zhukov, who had met General Eisenhower multiple times and toured the United States in 1945, understood American capacity better than perhaps any Soviet leader except Stalin. In 1957, during a speech about military preparedness, Zhukov mentioned in passing that Soviet forces must respect the potential of American industry. The comment was brief, carefully phrased, but officers who had been at the Elbe understood what he meant. He had seen what they had seen. He knew what they knew. and he was warning the Soviet leadership not to underestimate an opponent whose soldiers threw away food while fighting wars. The Cold War that followed was partly shaped by observations made at the Elbe River in April of 1945. The Iron Curtain that descended across Europe was designed to prevent not only military threats, but also ideological contamination through comparison. The Berlin blockade of 1948 was an attempt to force Western allies out of Berlin before the contrast between sectors became too obvious to Soviet citizens in the Eastern Zone. The blockade failed, and Americans responded with the Berlin airlift, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies by air over 15 months, demonstrating logistics capabilities that Soviet planners knew they could not match. West Berlin citizens watched American planes land every 3 minutes for over a year, bringing food and fuel and medicine, while Soviet authorities insisted that capitalism was dying and socialism represented humanity's future. Golosov lived until 1987. Retired engineer, veteran of the Great Patriotic War, decorated for service at Stalingrad and Kursk and Berlin. He never owned a car. Few Soviet citizens did. He stood in lines for food into the 1950s, received rationed goods through the 1960s, watched meat and butter disappear from stores in the 1970s. He remembered the Hershey bar he had given his daughter in 1945, remembered how Private Huff had given it to him without expecting anything in return, remembered the casual abundance of an army that could afford to give chocolate to allies and enemies alike. In 1985, during Glasnost, a journalist interviewed Golosov about meeting Americans at the Elbe. The journalist asked what surprised him most about American forces. Golosov thought for a long time before answering. He said, "They threw away food, half-eaten cans of meat. They threw them away because they had more. I think that was when I understood we had won the war, but maybe lost something else." The photographs taken at Torgau in April of 1945 still exist in archives in both countries. They show Soviet and American soldiers standing together, arms around shoulders, smiling for cameras. The photographs show uniforms and weapons and faces. They do not show chocolate bars changing hands, or cigarettes distributed freely, or the realization forming in Soviet minds that their supposed superiority was contradicted by observable reality. They do not show Lieutenant Golosov understanding that the American private standing beside him lived better than Soviet officers, that American abundance was not temporary or lucky, but systematic and permanent, that the ideological framework he had been taught was incomplete at best and false at worst. The photographs show friendly soldiers celebrating victory. What happened inside Soviet minds as they processed what they had seen remains invisible, documented only in careful reports and buried observations and memories that could not be spoken aloud without consequences. The meeting at the Elbe was meant to symbolize Allied unity and shared triumph over fascism. Instead, it became the first battle of a different war, fought not with weapons, but with washing machines and chocolate bars, and the demonstrated capacity to produce abundance so casually that waste required no justification. Soviet officers were shocked not by American military power, which they had expected, but by American material prosperity, which their entire ideological education had taught them was impossible under capitalism. That shock, carefully hidden and never officially acknowledged, shaped the next 45 years of history, and ended only when the system built on denying observable reality finally collapsed under the weight of contradictions that began at a river in Germany, where Soviet soldiers first tasted American chocolate and realized that everything they had been told about the dying West was systematically, comprehensively, undeniably wrong.